I think that could be an episode onto itself. How TV companies don't really work, how they crash and burn.
I love that. I love that. We're just here talking about Dunder Mifflin and, one of our favorite shows that we like to watch. Well, here we are. Welcome back, everybody, to the Data Rich Show. I've got Robert Rand joining us from JetRails and a new co-host, Mr. Spencer Connell from the Praxis team. How are you guys doing today?
Good. How are you?
Awesome.
Yeah, doing great.
Awesome. I figured we just jump right in. We're all excited to be here. Now, Robert, I want to thank you again. You had us on your podcast, Meaghan and I, a few months ago on your JetRails podcast, and we wanted to return the favor because you have a depth of knowledge regarding something that I don't think e-commerce companies, team members, marketers, owners really understand the impact that can have. So could we start off with who you are, what you do, and then we'll get into a little bit of what JetRails does.
Sure. So I'm Robert Rand. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Alliances at JetRails. I've been working in the e-commerce industry for well over a decade now, helped to build up a digital agency, Rand Marketing, that was an Inc. 5000 company, Google Premier Partner, helped bring brands like Swiss Gear and Invicta Watches into e-commerce. We were the digital agency of record for organizations like the Florida Panthers hockey team. A lot of fun experiences through the years on that side of the house, looking at everything from design through the web development, especially for e-commerce brands, B2B and B2C, and all the digital marketing from top to bottom. So that full service experience, and have brought that through since that acquisition and my exit from the company into multi-channel integration, and now at JetRails, certainly mission critical web hosting. So a lot of fun there, and a lot of tidbits stuck in my brain that make my days a lot more interesting.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for the intro. And so before we jump into like what JetRails really does and what we're really going to discuss today, why is data important to you?
So I find that everything in the e-commerce world is a mix of art and science. The math tells the story that you can strategize all that you want, but if you don't stop and check the numbers, you're working backwards. So it starts with proper setup for that, and it goes through actually taking the time to run the right reports and look at the right metrics and define those metrics properly. Sometimes people think that they know, but they don't. We know that the biggest companies out there are absolutely thriving on data. They're not really, companies that have products the way that we used to think of it. They're really data companies.
Yep.
And so the ability to help small businesses to leverage that is something that I find that I hold near and dear, that whether it's small or medium or even small, medium enterprise, the SME space, that there's a lot of folks that are still learning and growing in the data space day to day. And we know that that's where they grow. That's where they surpass the plateaus that they otherwise reach.
You're right. Yeah. What we like to say at Praxis is that data is the new competitive advantage. And every single modern company today is actually a data company. They just don't know it yet. And if they don't know it yet, or if they're not using data, like you just said, their competitors are. And they're the ones that are going to scale and grow much faster than the ones that don't have a hang on their data. And it doesn't mean you have to be data experts, right? It just means that if you understand the needle movers, if you understand some of what the story your data is telling you, that's just enough of that edge to be able to grow and scale much faster. So thank you for that. I love the answer. So right now, at the time of this podcast, we're coming up into, I think it's less than 30 days away from Black Friday, and Cyber Monday, the end of the year, big, crazy push that everybody's looking for. And I know you have some stats, Robert, on what the potential is for the end of the year. What was it? It's in the trillions, right?
Oh my goodness. It's, the growth every year. What we're seeing is that, traditional brands have had to become more so e-commerce first in a lot of ways. That mad rush of people running over each other to get into that retail store is not what it used to be. We've reached a point where the shopper can actually show up, get in, and get out, because a lot of the sales are starting in advance online. We're also Cyber Monday, which a lot of us years ago might have thought was going to be a fad. That, oh yeah, it'll be a thing, but then why is anybody going to wait for Monday? Well, it's a thing.
Yep.
I think we could probably share some notes for show notes
Yeah.
afterward with some of the top stats that we've been seeing, but the predictions are usually pretty spot on. And some of the companies like Adobe that have great analytics data that aggregate it for the world, they continue to show the upward swing. So what we've seen consistently is that brands really need to be ready for the online traffic more than anything else, because if they can't capture people's attention, it's no longer just about getting a circular out and expecting people to line up in front of a brick and mortar store. It's a journey. They're going to be researching through your site well before Black Friday. They're going to be anticipating, they're going to be coming to the site and, expecting that they're going to be able to get through and get what they want when they want it. It's an entire process now. And again, leading through that weekend and Cyber Monday, and then through the rest of their shopping experience, that not everyone gets all their shopping done right after Thanksgiving. No big surprise there that I'll probably be one of those folks that's still ordering things at the last minute. You have to be able to continue to perform throughout that entire season.
Yeah, well said. The opportunity is massive. And this episode right here, what we're talking about is how do we maximize that? How do we help you listening right now, involved in an e-commerce company, or maybe you have a digital company selling digital products? We want to make sure that you take a big advantage of this. So basically our question here is, how can e-commerce companies impact success right now before the big end of the year push? And usually on this show, we're talking about the data, the conversions, the traffic, the acquisition, and all those exciting, sexy metrics. But today with Robert, we're going to dig into some metrics that may not be on your radar. And that's what's really important, is happening underneath the grid, more on a technical side. So Robert, how do you want to jump into what are the most important, impactful things that we need to look for to maximize this holiday season?
Absolutely. And, coming at it from the web hosting perspective, a lot of it's absolutely infrastructure. And just like if you were talking about a brick and mortar store and talking about keeping the electricity on and making sure that you're not blowing circuit breakers because you've got too many store displays plugged in and too much going on. And, this is the time of year when a lot of retailers, a lot of, B2C businesses, they have to be performing at their best. They can't afford to have downtime or blips on the radar. And so a lot of best practice really comes down to making sure that you have the right resources ready to go, that you have your security really down pat, that, you never want to have a security issue, but certainly not at your busiest time of year. You can't afford it.
And what do you mean by that? It's like security issues. Let's get really specific.
Yeah. So in a lot of cases, there are e-commerce platforms that are popular in the market, whether it's Magento or WooCommerce or any number of platforms out there that you need to have security patches. You need to have software updates. You need your hosting environment to be up to date with software like Linux and PHP being up to date. You need firewalls that are properly calibrated, around your security needs and your website. Ideally, you should have proactive monitoring in place. It shouldn't be just about complete, one-off defense, but you should almost be on the offense with it. The same way that, you wouldn't want your store broken into in the middle of the night, have no alarms, and have everything, gone in the morning. You want to do your best that if something does happen, to be mitigating it in real time, to be, dealing with, let's say there's a DDoS attack, a denial of service attack, basically, whether it's a competitor or just someone that, I don't know, that you got on their bad side. They're sending you a bunch of bot traffic, fake traffic to overwhelm your website. You need to have firewalling and, other best practices in place, like a content delivery network and caching systems that'll help to lessen the burden on your web hosting, so that when things like that happen, it's going to be a lot harder to overwhelm your hosting environment. If you're a bigger merchant, you probably want auto scaling. You want to be in a cloud like AWS with a system that is going to spin up to handle whatever gets thrown at it. At the same time, back to that proactive layer, when something like, like an attack is happening, you want to be blocking off that bad traffic or whatever those sources of malicious activity are. You don't want to let that fester and turn into a problem, because no matter like most security, if you leave it unchecked, uh, someone's going to figure out a way to overwhelm, to basically storm the castle.
Yep.
You can't just send home your archers for, for the entire duration of the war because you built up a pretty good wall.
It's Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I know, right? That's why it's about, in some cases, so having resource that's going to be proactive is important, and having vendors that do that for you is important. But it's also important to have a support plan. So in e-commerce, we believe it takes a village. You have your web hosts, you have like JetRails, you have your web developers, whether they're in-house or whether you've got an agency or some other dev team or a group that you've brought in for that. You have this mix of different groups. You have your payment processors that during an uptick, they might think that something looks weird, and they could freeze something. You've got all these different things coming together, just like in traditional brick and mortar, just like you have credit card processing there, and computer systems, and electric vendors, and also all sorts of things. You need to have a short list of emergency contacts at the ready, and you need to know who to call for what, in order to cut down downtime. And you need to know who's on standby for you, that there is somebody that you can reach in an emergency, that's going to have your back. So
that's all, Robert. This is awesome. And I want to slow you down a little bit, because you just covered a lot of stuff there.
Yeah.
So I want to bring it back to like, how do we really make this actionable? So what I hear you saying, and I want to speak from the e-commerce owner standpoint, and no matter what revenue size you are right now, I'm saying, wow, Robert, so you mean out of the box, Shopify and the things that I'm on aren't going to protect me? Yes or no?
My answer to that is no.
No, right? It's not out of the box going to give you that layer of security that you may need, right? From a security standpoint.
You absolutely still have best practices, whether you're on Shopify or BigCommerce or a different SaaS solution, or whether you're on an on-prem open source solution like a Magento site. The difference is that your security footprint might not be as vast with one of those SaaS solutions, software as a service, where it's in the cloud, and some of that is managed by this third party, by Shopify or BigCommerce or one of these other companies. You're still responsible for lots of things, keeping your logins safe, making sure that the coding that you have in your website is secure, that just because their base platform is managed by their team. If you're using a bunch of apps, making sure that the apps or extensions or plugins or modules or add-ons or whatever they're being called in the platform that you're using, there's a lot of synonyms out there, that those are secure. And so there are principles that we always recommend putting into place, regardless of what platform you're on. Things like least privileged access. Basically, if someone doesn't need access to something, you don't give it to them. You don't need to give full admin access to your website to someone that's just responsible for adding some blog posts. You don't need to give vendors access to your website that they need for a week and then never revoke that, never turn it off. There's a lot of different things that can go into that. The same thing that, less is more. So, you've got these 10 apps installed, and each one could potentially cause you some grief. So are you really getting your value out of them? Do you really need them? Or are they just slowing down your site? Are they just potential, security threats to be exploited? And so really, taking the time to look at some of those things becomes very important. And I know I'm moving fast, but I just touched on speed, which is another area that I'm sure we're going to talk about today, because that one is going to impact your conversion rate directly. And that's pretty trackable, and that's very effective. So
I want to get to that one later. Conversions later.
I think we're going to have to really dive into that. But I would say a monitoring plan for the overall uptime and health of your website, to know if anything's going wrong, to be getting alerts. is going to be important, and having that support action plan of, if there is a problem with anything at all, who's responsible and how are you going to get them, and how responsive are they going to be? What are your expectations? What are you going to need to do in damage control mode?
That seems like that's one of the most important parts here, because as e-commerce owners, any business or entrepreneur, like, you've got so many things going on, especially for maximizing this sales cycle coming up. You don't know what to look for, right? Like, most people don't know. So a lot of these things you talked about might go way over their head. So what is it? Like, there's services like JetRails that we're talking about, like, they alert you and say, hey, we're going to do an audit of what's going on to find if there's any holes in the bucket. And then we want to plug those holes so that you are protected. And then we'll let you know when things come up, right? Things like that exist so that the owners the e-commerce companies don't have to, like, go figure this out if they don't have an IT team or an analyst on their team that knows how to do this stuff.
And I'll give you a few examples, and they're not something that are only related to JetRails. You can go to other vendors and get resources. In our case, we're more of a white glove service, so we're here to treat everything as mission critical, and part of that persona is providing a more complete service to our clients. What we do leading into the holidays, we offer load testing, and that allows us to be able to throw a bunch of traffic at your site. We do that in a very strategic way. Ideally, we do it to a staging copy of the website, not the live site, or if we have to do it to the live site, we do it off hours, maybe in the middle of the night when you're less impacted by it. We look to see what are the weak links in the chain. So is there a bottleneck in the web hosting that might get overwhelmed if your traffic spikes the way that it may during Black Friday or Cyber Monday or some other major marketing event or holiday or seasonality issue? We also want to see on the application layer, is your website going to hold up? So, you've applied security patches and software updates and done all these good things. Well, your site isn't exactly the same as it was last year, and you may have more shoppers than ever. You may have more traffic. You really want to know in advance that your site's ready. So we offer that as a service. We're actually with a few partners, including Praxis Metrics, we're offering a free load test for Magento merchants leading into the holiday shopping season. Something that we're doing for a limited time with a few select partners. We find that it's crucial for merchants to know that in advance, to be able to sleep at night knowing that things are right, not guessing that they're right.
So if there's one thing out of security, scalability, uptime, and all that, it's really a load test. Is that, like, the one thing that's probably most important right now?
I would say that's the thing that's going to be more out of the ordinary for a lot of merchants. They should be keeping an eye on their security all year long. That, I can't suggest ever letting that escape you. And there's a lot that can be done for that. But load testing is something that a lot of merchants don't undergo the rest of the year. And now's the time to do it before you hit your peak traffic for the year. Yeah. You don't want to get caught with your pants down, proverbially speaking.
So that makes sense to me. And I'm wondering, what if there's, a lot of people think, oh, well, I'm on Shopify or I'm on Magento, or I'm on these and I'm safe. Well, we're saying that you're not, but their host, right? The host is what's really important here, because that's the gateway bringing the traffic through, right? So the host is that input. That's like the gatekeeper. Right?
Yeah. So when you're on Magento, PrestaShop, WooCommerce, Xcart, when you're on an on-prem, absolutely. A lot of these SaaS companies, that by nature, BigCommerce, Shopify, they are meant to scale, and they do have a pretty good history of getting their merchants through the holidays. But keep in mind that they're responsible for the plain vanilla copy of the site that you spin up when you first set up a trial or pay them their, whatever it is a month, that everything that you've done to the site can still have an impact. So
yeah, so they're doing and we're not bashing them at all. We're saying they're doing what they can control, but there's a lot of other variables that are potential threats to knocking down your website when, hey, if you're in the middle of a launch or you're in the middle of this season and your site goes down, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not sometimes millions of dollars of lost revenue if these holes are plugged?
Absolutely, and I'll give you an example of another best practice that that relates directly. We recommend by this time of year that merchants are looking at a coding freeze. In essence, if your site's working now, stop touching it.
Like stop tweaking it,
That's
stop trying
right.
to improve it, stop.
That's
Are
right.
you also talking about stop split testing, or just what is that? Let's kind of dig into that.
Not
What do
so
you
that's
mean?
that's a really good question. So I wouldn't necessarily stop with content related issues. You can be adding product through the back end of your website, through your website's admin console or portal. You can be adding blog posts. You can be you can be going ahead and uh, dealing with other normal day-to-day business. On the other hand, this would not, and so let's say you want to add, change a banner, go for it. I wouldn't be installing new updates that aren't, required, that aren't a major security patch or something that's really, really high priority. I wouldn't be installing new plugins and sort of things from your, it would be nice to have list. This is not the time where I'd be experimenting. I would be sticking with only things that are considered a high priority, more or less emergency, that this gets pushed out. Otherwise, I would try to leave the theme, the core, the heart of the website as it is, because if you know it's working, the last thing you want to do is put something in there that may add some bugs, and this is not the time that you want to be
theme updates,
finding out
things
the
like
hard way.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good tip. That's a really good tip.
Yeah.
Quick
A/B
question.
testing, generally, if you're using a good A/B testing system in the Magento community, we run into systems like High Conversion a lot. I'm sure that your team's got some favorites. I wouldn't necessarily stop that those are usually pretty safe to use. A lot of those are delivered through systems that can handle it well. But like everything else, that then becomes part of your action plan for support, that you have to be making sure that if that has a problem, how to disable it or who to reach out to, who's responsible for it. In essence, it is another thing that you're running. So I believe in that for anything that's active in the site.
Awesome. Go ahead, Spencer.
And with that coding freeze, does that extend towards things like Google Tag Manager and adding new sort of like tracking things or anything like that? Since that is deployed primarily through Google Tag Manager, I was curious how that affects the site.
Some of this certainly does come down to personal preference. If I was going to spin up a new marketing campaign and I needed a new tag, I would put it in Tag Manager and I would feel good about it. That's a container that's pretty safe to contribute to or to make adjustments in. Obviously, you're going to test those tags and feel good about them, that they're working and healthy. I wouldn't necessarily forego a smaller change like that, especially because you need the data. So going back to where we started the conversation today, this is going to be some of the juiciest data of the year, and this data is going to help you throughout the coming year, and certainly as you plan for the next holiday shopping season. So I would prioritize that as something that's going into a pretty safe container, and not necessarily, it has a very low likelihood of impacting other things.
Great question.
Great question. Yeah.
So, all right, so let's get into a little more sexy stuff. This was all a great foundation of pain points we need to cover, but let's get into conversion. And without monitoring site performance and issues, there's all sorts of factors that we've talked about or that you mentioned that could affect the bottom line. Let's focus on like one or two really, really important ones. We talked about speed last time. How does that affecting our conversion rate?
Yeah, so speed is one of my favorites. By far, it's something that I'm always amazed at how many merchants, they know that they care about speed, but they don't necessarily measure it regularly. They don't necessarily invest into speeding up their site. We know there are numerous studies. I'll definitely share a few for show notes for this one, that talk from groups like Google, that we trust the data from, about how if your site is taking longer than 3 seconds to load, you're missing the boat. And so there are layers of things that you can be doing to make sure that you're getting the speed that you're looking for. And like everything else in e-commerce, it's a lot of interconnected things. It's not one thing. There is no one panacea that'll solve it all. And so the few areas that I like to break this down to, you have your content itself, things like rich media, images. Those should be properly scaled. They should be properly compressed and basically served up at a size that makes sense. That think about it like, you don't need something that that you're gonna, I don't know, print out a poster for in perfect, crisp, imagery from a high quality printing press or something. You need something that looks good on a monitor, on a screen. And so there are best practices for that. You set your images to 72 DPI. You choose a size of the file accordingly. You use certain file types. There's a lot that goes into that. There are systems that you can use that'll just automatically clean up the images before you upload them into your website. There are systems that can be added to certain types of sites that'll automate some of this. But it's a small thing that you can do that can have a big impact because it's file sizes. It's instead of taking 10 megabytes of files to load your homepage, you get it down to 1. And it has a big impact. That's stuff that most end users understand. The more files, the bigger the files, the longer it takes, the slower things are. The same applies, with that in mind, to the theme of your website, the template that it's using, the designs overall. So there are things that you can do, and there are some automated systems that can help with this, to compress files, minimize files, combine a bunch of files into one, so that instead of having a bunch of separate CSS or HTML or JavaScript files, you get one of each, that it takes less time to transmit, it's faster to load in a browser. So there are things that can be done by your web developers, and that does get a bit more technical, but just understanding that these are conversations worth having with whoever your web development resource is, to make sure that the latest iteration of your website, and I say that carefully because just because you did some loading speed optimization in the past, you've made all sorts of updates to your site, doesn't mean that everything's optimized today. Doesn't mean you haven't put a bunch of things in there that now are slow and not meeting your best practice.
Yep.
So we get through sort of that front end of the website, the content and the development, and then you've got the back end. You've got your web hosting layer, and there's a laundry list that we look at, and at JetRails we do a quick audit for folks, just a free audit to give them an idea on some of the things that we're seeing. We love to look at the time to first byte. That's basically how long it takes the server to crunch everything and start responding to the web visitor, to their browser, with files, with information, to start loading it in their browser. And a lot of the time we'll get merchants where it's taking easily 2-3 seconds instead of maybe 100 or 200 milliseconds to start serving those things up. And we immediately know, well, this needs some optimization, this needs some work. There are other layers to it. Caching is important. So there's all sorts of different caching technology out there. Basically what that's doing is taking all these different files that you have that need to be pulled and shown together in a particular layout for your website, pulling together different elements for the browser, for the user. And instead of making your server pull all those things individually each time, I like to think of it like fast food. It puts together the bun and the burger and the ketchup and the onions and pickles and relish, whatever else. It creates it. It puts it in a wrapper and it's sitting there in the warmer, so that when somebody comes and they want the burger, in this case they want to load a particular page in your website, these elements are already together, and the server in this case, think of it like the person behind the counter at the fast food restaurant, can just grab it and hand it right over. So there's some stuff there that you'd be surprised that is common, but not as common as it should be. That it's best practice, but depending on whether or not you've taken the time to get this properly set up and whether your developers have properly fine-tuned it for you, you may not be getting what you want out of it. And the last one that I'll add to this list quickly would be a content delivery network, a CDN. In essence, instead of having your website completely served up by wherever your website is hosted, whatever servers you have, there are companies out there like Cloudflare. We partner with them. We do a lot of work with them. There's some other good ones out there that we run into as well that we support merchants with, and they have servers all over the globe. They save copies of a lot of the front end files, these bigger image files and media files and other things that aren't particularly changing all that much. Not like things that need to come out of the database in real time because your product inventory is changing. People are buying and now this is out of stock. That needs to come right from your main hosting servers. But your content delivery network can serve up from servers all over the world a lot of the files that are loading your website. And that takes some of the pressure off of your main hosting environment. It also gives people files from servers that are close to them. So where your main web hosting might be out of Chicago, a visitor that's hitting the website from California, when we're using Cloudflare, they're getting a lot of the files from a server that's very close to them in California. And that's going to also help to cut down on a little bit of that time. And when it comes to loading speed optimization, the milliseconds start to add up, start to turn into seconds. So there are all these layers, and systems like Cloudflare have added on to that service where they'll help to optimize the images, and they'll help to combine files and do other things right there in this network that they operate, to help you get more bang for your buck. And some of these things are rather cheap to implement. So it's not necessarily about being a big expense all the time. That Cloudflare has plans starting from free to $20 a month to some pretty advantageous stuff. So
I was just going to ask that. Well, that was on my mind, is like, okay, there's a lot of stuff we're talking about, and when it gets to tech stuff, people think, oh my gosh, this could be expensive. But just kind of reviewing what you've been talking about, one, Cloudflare just said, it's a tool we've used before. I think our team might even use it, Spencer. I think Raj might have put that on. But like, some of these things are not expensive to do, and they're things that they can do, our e-commerce companies can do right now in the next 30 days or less than 30 days before the big sales, right?
Yeah.
So one is what I wanted to also mention was like working with your developer or your designer. Sometimes the designers want to create the beautiful thing for the website, not knowing this back end. So I think sharing an interview like this, sharing this content with the design team, if they don't know about optimization of the images, they need to understand that. And you won't know to ask them, right? If you're assuming that they know this stuff, that's a big mistake we've made in the past, where it's like, hey, we got the design we want, but we're like, why is this taking forever to load, or what's going on? And we did a speed test, and we know, oh my gosh, they didn't optimize anything. Sometimes web designers and web developers change. That standard operating procedure might not have been carried over to that person, you don't know. So doing an audit, a mini audit in each of these areas, you said design, development, and then on the back end, a couple of different places, right? Is the speed test and audit. And then what is the other audit? Security.
So security. And I'll add to that the web developers, in a lot of cases, if a web developer says, hey, do you want me to spend some time poking around and making sure everything, is coming up roses in the back of your site, and a lot of the time that, the knee-jerk reaction is, well, no, I don't want to spend money on that. The site works. There can be things lurking. So I'll, as I create this list here in live time, I'll add that having your developers check your logs, look for errors and exceptions that on a small scale, when you're not as busy, you might not notice or might not be causing you too much grief. But when you're busy, you're going to be sorry that that this page is having loading issues that you're not even aware of because you haven't checked the logs, or or this error is being thrown when users are trying to take a certain action in the website or use a certain module. So it's good to go through and look for anything that's in the site that you're not using and get it disabled or turned off. Any of those modules or add-ons or extensions or apps. Look for errors and exceptions in your logging. It's good to review your loading speed, and that's best done with your developers and your web host together. it's best to even check things like, again, a good web host is monitoring things for you, like your disk space. This is not the time when you want to run out of hard disk space and have issues. Now, there are different types of hosting environments. Some can auto scale certain things, give you more resource when you need it. But sometimes that brings a false sense of security. Uh, it's still best practice to do things like the load test that we were talking about, because you don't know what the weak point is. And even if your hosting environment auto scales, if your website has a bottleneck, if some feature in your website just slows down the site terribly when too many users are trying to utilize it, you need to know.
Okay. So is it safe to say, no matter whether they're, on their own hosting outside of JetRails, like an audit from you guys could actually help, just doing the audit and giving them the information. But
Yes.
I'm also thinking it's probably would behoove everybody listening to like get back in contact with their host. Have someone on the team maybe contact them, call them and say, hey, I just want to kind of make sure that I'm ready for this holiday season. Disk space, error logs, like some hosting company support may be better than others, of course, but doesn't it make sense to like maybe get that relationship going again and ask a few questions? We can maybe add these to the show notes too.
Yeah. And the other thing that I would look at, if you're an SMB merchant and you're in a shared hosting account, I would be, looking at your options. Long term, that can be advantageous. You can get shared hosting for, $5, $10, $20 a month. You can be in what we call a multi-tenant environment, where you might be in a cloud, but it's not single tenant. It's not just you in there. There's other websites that are sharing resources in some sort of a shared environment. The problem with that is that if someone else that's on this server or in this cloud environment that you're sharing with has a security issue, that can bleed over to you. If someone else in that environment is having a big traffic spike and using up all the resources in the server, all the CPU and RAM and all that juicy stuff, it can impact your site and take down your site. So what we often find is that, that might be a starting place budget-wise, but that as you grow, sometimes merchants get lulled into a false sense of security that, well, it's worked for me in the past. And you do get to a point where your brand becomes more important to you, where you can't afford the downtime, you can't afford to have issues impact your brand. You don't want to have something that either costs you too much money in the short term or slows down your brand growth because you've turned off people that, now they got some big red warnings in their in their browser or dead pages or things, and they don't know about giving their credit card to your site anymore. That there's been a lot of credit card fraud out there in recent years, especially as chips have been added to credit cards, and it's been harder to clone them and use them in brick and mortar stores. So, it's in some cases easier to try to enter the credit card numbers into a website where that chip isn't used. And so we've seen that, shoppers have a low threshold for security issues or other outages and things that they just, perceive as taking away some of their sense of security, some of their trust in your website.
Awesome, Robert. Well, I know we've covered a lot of stuff here. Let's kind of simplify this down to one last thing here before we get off. First, I want to learn more about this audit. So can you talk about like the one thing that they can go right now and do with JetRails? It's a free audit, but tell us a little bit more about that, and then we'll tell them where to go get it, and then we'll wrap up with one last final thought from you.
Yeah. So at jetrails.com, if you head down to our footer, you're going to see a load testing page. And, if you go fill out that form there, mention Praxis metrics, that you're a Praxis client, or, that you've, found us this way. We'll evaluate with you if a load test is for you, and we'll be able to, as someone that's not yet part of the JetRails family, will be able to help you out with that first load test. That's regardless of where your site's hosted. We're doing this as a courtesy. As long as you're in an environment that'll support a load test, where you're not in a shared environment where we're going to throw a bunch of traffic at a server that's going to take down all your neighbors on that server, we're in pretty good shape. So we have a lot of flexibility there for users that are on Magento websites, or that are on, in some cases, other on-prem solutions as well, other Linux-based solutions where our systems are built to load test. So that's a great one, and you can reach out to us through any of our social media too. We'll respond, at JetRails through Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or what have you, and you'll get us, and we're happy to help you out.
Awesome. So I think this is a huge thing to go do right now. The earlier you start taking action on what we talked about today, the less stressful you'll feel. We want you to have a good holiday season and a successful one and a profitable one. So this is just a few things you can go do right now to make sure you're ready for the holiday season. All right, Robert, before Spencer, do you have any other questions?
I know that we've talked a lot about audits. I was curious if there's like a timeline when people should be running these audits on their systems. Is it every 3 months, 6 months, once a year, just before a big launch like Black Friday or a new marketing campaign?
Great question.
So my answer, wearing more than one hat, both coming from the agency side of things and here at JetRails, is that a lot of these should be ongoing. Ideally, you should know that your security is in good shape, and you should have proactive monitoring and management. You should know that your loading speed is in good shape, and it should be proactively monitored. You should know that your uptime is solid, and that you're not missing out on the fact that you're having outages at different times that you're just not noticing, and that you haven't put two and two together. You should have a team that's reaching out to you and reminding you to load test and do other things, and that's checking in with you. And so that's what we do at JetRails. We deal with it all proactively, dedicated account managers taking care of our clients. That's best practice. Beyond that, I think a lot of it has to do with the size of the company and the resources available. So ideally, you should be testing your loading speed as you make changes to the site and seeing what the impact is. And so if you're pushing updates to the site twice a year, well, you should be testing each time and making sure that you haven't thrown that into a state of disarray. Security, I would say, there's different types of security testing, but it should be more frequent, because depending on the platform that you're on, depending on what you're doing, you really don't want to be sitting in an unsecure state for long, and you may have missed out on a security patch or something else that's been released. You do want to be auditing that, from my perspective, in an ongoing fashion, but I'd say for a more thorough look at it, if you don't have someone that's keeping an eye on it for you, at least monthly, ideally, I think quarterly is waiting a long time. So each one of these things is a little bit different. For load testing, best to do it when you are expecting a traffic spike, or other peak traffic, or when you've made significant changes to the site and you want to make sure that you haven't done anything that's going to bottleneck your website. So with load testing, if you get a big surge for Valentine's Day or Mother's Day, or you just, you're going to be, you've taken yourself for some TV segment, you're going to be on Oprah next week, then time is of the essence, that you want to be testing when you need to be testing.
Great question and great answer. Like, always be ready for any of these big spikes. Just know that having this extra readiness, whether you pay a company like JetRails to do it for you, or you just set up just go into the calendar and put on every month that the team or the IT team or somebody needs to take some hours and go through this data. Or contact the webmaster. I think this is phenomenal. I really have not had a session like this, a conversation around data in this respect. So I think this was super helpful. So what are we going to leave with? What's the one thing that you want to leave with our audience about this subject? One thing, the most important thing that makes everything else easier or unnecessary.
Pick the right vendors, trust them, sleep well at night.
Love it. Nice.
That's what I'm all about. You don't want to go through the holiday shopping season and find out that you don't have the right data, that data is valuable. You don't want to go through and find out that you've had hosting problems, you don't want to go through and find out that you haven't properly gone through user acceptance testing and that there are problems in your website, that there's user functionality that doesn't cut it, and that, if you would just place some test orders yourself, run through the site yourself, that you would have noticed. It is about pulling together the resources, working as a team. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about. If you don't have the right people by your side, whether they're in-house or whether they're third-party vendors that are going to work together and work as a team, as if they're all working for the same company, it's not gonna come together. I oversee partnerships and alliances. I'm a partnership guy, and I really believe in companies coming together to work toward the same end game. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about getting stuff done.
I love it. Love it. Robert, thank you so much for your help today. We covered a lot of ground. We're going to put a lot of other stuff in the show notes. And I really think everybody should go get their load test as soon as possible. And that'll wrap us up today. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.